Well, good afternoon to the people who have joined us from the other session. Thanks for coming over. And I'm going to try and take you through good concept definition, whole life cycle cost analysis. But I'd like to do it in something that I'm familiar with at the moment, is where reservoir and facilities and economics join together. And I hope that the example that I'm using will give you an overview of how that FPSO fits in and how that FPSO is such an integral part of what we do in an oil field development. So the area that I'm covering is the UK continental shelf at the moment, with the heavy oil successes there. I acknowledge that there's heavy oil around the world. West Africa, Brazil have been remarkably good, but also the North Sea, and quite recently too. We've developed in certain ways since the 1990s, and more recently with the Kraken and Mariner coming on board. What I'm looking at is bringing in existing technology into the offshore environment to make a step change in the way that we're able to develop certain fields. Those fields may be known as stranded or anything else at the moment. Any good work will need some sort of review against our peers. I heard the word benchmarking yesterday during the workshop, and I prefer more in-depth review of how we position ourselves at an early stage. Then introducing improved technology. We all know the difficulty. We're renowned in oil and gas for being very long in getting there. I'll give a couple of examples on some of the statements that we've had back. If you are going for innovation, the element of cooperation and collaboration, quite in words at the moment, are very, very real. None of us, we don't have these huge great oil companies anymore. They're smaller. We need the assistance of all the suppliers through the chain. I'll briefly look at the future price of heavy oil, if we can break that into a production of much larger quantities than we've seen before. And then finally, an acknowledgement to the way forward. So let's get technical. Well, not so much. Oil viscosity. We talk about heavy oil. It's not that heavy. It's just the relative amount to water. What's really important in the reservoir is the oil viscosity and its relationship to temperature. So on the left-hand side, put in some shots there to show the viscosity as you go from 1 centipoise of oil up through blood, olive oil, engine oil, and finally to honey. That takes you up to 10,000 centipoise. Bitumen is up towards 1 million, but we'll not consider that. Along the bottom area is, the bottom axis is temperature. That's degrees Fahrenheit for those who can't see behind. And what we see is for each density of oil, I think I go from 10 to 25 API, from heavy to light. There are different relationships of temperature and viscosity, approximately. The darker red line is the heavier oil, and therefore the higher viscosity. And what we see from the North Sea is there's certain fields that you may recognize there that have been developed over the last nearly 30 years. And we started off in the 1990s with Alba, Harding, and eventually Captain. Now, Alba and Harding, well, they're only about 9 centipoise, so it's not that viscous, but it was quite a challenge in those times. And I think there are a couple of others I didn't put on just to keep it not overpopulated, Gannet, Griffin. But Captain was interesting. It's got it's quite sticky, and we've managed to produce quite well from that over the last years, and it continues. Now, more recently, we've brought on stream Kraken. There you're moving over 100 centipoise. It's getting quite sticky. And the Mariner is broken up between two reservoirs. There's the lower Maureen, which is hotter and less biodegraded, and the higher Heimdall formation, which is actually where most of the oil is. So Statoil Mariner is going to be quite a challenge. We then have Brentley and Bressay. They're still in the pending tray. Maybe quite difficult for the moment. And then bringing on Pilot, we're actually a sausage. We've got viscosity roughly from Kraken up to about 1,000 centipoise. Now, if we develop that with the standard water flood, water injection, the big washing machine, we'll get about 13% of the oil out of the ground. We'll be leaving 87% in the ground. But if we're able to inject steam and warm up and pull us along, then the viscosity drops down to nearly water. In fact, we'll be 300 degrees centigrade, so further up here. That's the mechanical principle. What's the detail of it? Well, here's a plot which you don't often see. Any information I'm giving on other companies here is from the public source. We may have spoken to Kraken. These come from capital market days, information, etc. So I've plotted there the production of oil and water. The green at the bottom is oil. The blue is produced water. And then for completeness, I've shown in the pink is from the hydraulic submersible pumps. There's quite a lot of extra water that has to be produced. Well, with Kraken, we got about 80 to 160 centipoise. As far as I'm aware, they're re-injecting water at about the reservoir temperature, which would be, I think, 40 degrees centigrade. So they're keeping the enthalpy, the energy of the reservoir constant. Mariner, this is sticky, a little more difficult. It takes longer, over 30 years, to get out the oil, but there is twice as much oil coming out and only 50% more water being produced. But all the same, we see that we are handling a lot of water in heavy oil to get the production to market. Now, finally, this is Bentley. This is one that hasn't been produced yet, we saw on the previous graph. And down at the bottom, I'm not sure for the back, you can actually see the oil production. It's got a little bit of a plateau and then goes on a very long decline curve. To produce that, whereas about Mariner, Kraken, it's about 8% of the produced fluids is oil. Down here, we're down to about 4%. 96% is water. It takes 6 billion barrels of water to make 265 million barrels of oil. And that is one giant washing machine. And as an idea, the height of that curve corresponds in one way or another to the capex. How many wells do you need? How big are your vessels and treatment facilities, support facilities on an FPSO? The length is related to the OPEX. If you're out there for 35 years, then there's quite a lot of OPEX you're using in overall life cycle costs. Now, where does steam assist this, and what happens in the pilot field? Well, an equivalent curve looks like this. Small is beautiful. What we see here is we're producing as much oil as Kraken, but a fraction of the fluids. 250, we can do the calculation. What is happening is you're not cycling water in any way. You're getting the oil out, and the funny thing is that you get quite a flat plateau of production over the whole life and then you cut off. You don't allow steam to cycle round. So it's quite efficient. And what that means is the height of that is small, very small. So we've got reduced capex and we've got reduced opex in time. And that counteracts the cost of gas to produce the steam. Just an example, I think the steam production on Kraken is about 270 tons an hour of water utilised. We need 240 maybe. We need about 300 tons per hour to make all of that steam. So it's quite efficient. And here again, with my acknowledgements to Enquest and Statoil, this is very simplified comparative peer notes. We see that on Kraken, okay, the capex was quite low, but it's leased FPSO, not a huge company. And what's been nice is last year they announced a reduction in the capex, so they've been quite successful. Now, I brought out the key that they've got 25 subsea wells. They need that, I believe, because the field is actually very long, very thin. It's only about 1.5 kilometres across, and then about 11 kilometres up, which is too large to have platforms. So they've gone subsea, and 25 wells across 11 kilometres is quite big spacing on the well pattern. I'll come back to that in a minute, you'll see why. The water depth being 116 metres is probably on the limit as well of having a platform and jack-up drilling. The topsides is pretty classical. Now, Mariner, large oil company, they can afford to finance the 7.7 billion, so they own all of the facilities there. Now, they've put in a fixed platform because they've got 142 reservoir penetrations. So there's about 78 wells, and then there's multilateral dual completions off a lot of them. So it's sort of splayed out from their central platform. It's a much larger area that they're dealing with, maybe twice the area of Kraken. But their well density equivalent is about 100 metres compared to Kraken at 350 metres. That's why they're more efficient in terms of recovery per well. Now, on pilot development, what I'm showing here is we're going in with a fixed platform. We need dry wells because we're injecting steam, and unless somebody can come to me and show me how we can put steam into subsea wells at the moment with flexibles and the rest, we would put a simple platform in, put on some steam generation facilities and have the wellheads. Lease jack-up. There is possibilities to buy and operate. What we would do, though, is keep that jack-up there for the life of field. The life of field, remember, being very short, only about 10, 11 years. And that jack-up can supply a lot of the support for the unmanned simple platform. Accommodation, firewater, electrical distribution, storage. There's a lot that can be done there. So that becomes our central hub. And then on the bottom, I've just put a simplified chart of, we'll then send all of the product over to the FPSO for treatment, separation. We may degas on this facility to use the fuel gas for the boiler. Then again, we may send everything across because degassing increases the viscosity. As we go through the field, we're going to do a phased development so that you've got the drilling there, you go through, you produce a certain part, and then you put on a sister platform, which is, we're talking now about standardization. We can do this in phases. In fact, Statoil considered this sort of process for Bressay when they re-looked at it. Overall topsides, 10,000 tons. It depends how much we have on the jack-up, already and where we position stuff, we have a certain amount of choice of where we can put equipment on the real estate available. Just for those who are interested in the subsurface, we've got about 35 wells. Remember, Mariner had 142 for twice the amount of oil. I think it's 25 for Kraken, but a much wider spacing. So this gives us alternate injectors, so steam injectors horizontally, and alternate producers, coming back to the central facilities in the middle. I put up an idea of the overall life cycle costs that we've mentioned. That really translates into a net present value, which is a 10% discount, is around about $1 billion, just for this small field of 120 million barrels. And that gives us a Brent break-even of $36 a barrel, which I think is very competitive these days, even certainly more competitive than what BP's been looking at. That actually includes already a discount for the heavy oil. There's a certain discount for high TAN, high acidic crude. We don't have any asphaltenes, but there's a certain amount of discount to the Brent market. Just quickly, for your understanding, this is not actually on topic, but some people have been asking, what licenses does Steam Oil have? We've got 2 licenses. The central one I've been talking about is in the middle there with the blue background. That was our first one we got awarded. It contains the pilot field that we would intend developing first. And then last year we got awarded a second license around the outside in beige, which includes discoveries such as Blakeney, which can also almost double our reserves, and maybe some gas supply from Dandy South, Dandy North, maybe even Few, which can give us the boiler fuel for the steam. And, well, just at the bottom, quickly, we're about 50 kilometers west of Gannet. And then, if there's anybody in the audience who knows anything about FPSOs, you might recognize Anazuria, Triton. And we just left there about 140 kilometers east of Aberdeen. Now, the perceptions of steam injection offshore. University of Texas, 2008. North Sea reservoirs are too deep and above the pressure limits for successful application, full stop. Then, next is the NPC, the United States. Too much heat loss in the riser and to the ocean. And, well, they started off with no as well. And then this one, interestingly, is Chevron themselves. And they've come back and they've actually spoken with us. So we can take this with a pinch of salt. They said that the heat losses above the mudline could be unacceptably large. Well, we've had a look at it, and we've had it independently verified. If you go with a vertical well through a small reservoir, there you'll generally inject 1,000, we talk in barrels of water for steam, 1,000 barrels of water. You'll get 300-400 barrels condense through heat losses. But if your well is 1.8 kilometers, like into the next room, on a horizontal completion, you can put in 10,000 barrels a day, up to 30,000 barrels a day. The heat losses remain the same, 300 barrels. It's not worth considering. So those issues with horizontal wells we've overcome. And then finally, this is an unnamed consultancy in 2003 who reviewed Pilot for screening. And their thought was, well, wet trees make the problem insurmountable. Why wet trees? Why subsea wells? Because it was decided to go that way. And from 2003 onwards, all the previous license holders have looked at subsea wells. It's only in 80 metres of water. We can do this with a platform. So that, I think, we've got over as well. Other perceptions, there's about 2 million barrels of oil produced around the world from steam-enabled production. Slightly different techniques to our steam flood. There's SAG-D, you might have heard of, huff and puff, cyclic steam injection. But there's still a lot of preconceptions about heavy oil production and steam-enabled. And the first one to look at there is the historical variability of heavy reservoir performance and flow assurance. The performance issues are often due to the reservoir itself. If you're working with highly fractured carbonates, there's no permeability through there, and the heavy oil just doesn't come out. And if you put steam in, it'll channel through the fractures. We've got clastic sandstones, highly permeable, highly porous. Flow assurance, yes. Up at the top there, I've got semi-analytical modelling of the wellbore. You can see that some of the flows and pressures there are all over the place. We have temperatures from 30 degrees to 220 degrees, which is unusual, but it's done around the world. And then at the bottom, as everybody else is familiar, a lot of emulsions can be created, foaming. We can have deposits of naphthanates, calcium naphthanate deposits, sodium naphthanate soaps, but all of this we're familiar with, and there's a lot of ways of working around it. The concept that FPSOs are late and over budget, I'm against that, but I've come up across it from a lot of potential investors. So we've spoken with a lot of people to ensure that we're on the right track and to ensure that other parties are informed as we go through. In terms of technology, most of what we want to introduce is available today, and there's a huge amount of experience that we at Steam Oil and our potential partners would like to be able to obtain and share with others. As I said, there's 2 million barrels produced per day onshore, a lot of good information. The only piece of kit that we really needed to develop was a high temperature downhole safety valve. Onshore you don't use that, you have surface interruption, but offshore that is required. We're developing high temperature works with well-centric. Now the rest of the equipment and technologies there, I've chosen more or less at random, so if you're not on the list, don't worry. And I've mentioned some companies because I've used your pictures. Automatic inflow control valve is fundamental. If you've got 2 wells, one injecting steam, as the steam billows and comes to the second well, you need to be able to stop it immediately. And at each joint along the drill pipe of the completion, there would be an autonomous inflow which reacts to changes in density of the fluids coming through it. Obviously, coalescers, we had originally a lot of problems with those in heavy oil, as there's too much water carryover from the initial separation into the electrostatics. Improvements in insulated electrodes has certainly helped that. And also, Total have developed a wash tank process of separation and emulsion, de-emulsifying and separation on a lot of FPSOs, which is now marketed by Sulzer. And there's advanced chemical treatment, low emission burners. We're going to be burning quite a lot of gas. We'll be creating a lot of very clean water to put in the boiler, and there is good reverse osmosis experience offshore, sulfur removal. BP are doing low sal up in Clare, and some of the small footprint ultrafiltration is becoming very useful as well. Standardization, I already mentioned that. It goes further. If we're doing a main hub and then developing across the field, we would want repeat platforms, a repeat FPSO. And then one which is massive is monitoring and control. Heavy oil can be a very non-Newtonian fluid. Look downhole initially, probably downhole fiber optic to be able to measure temperature fluctuations and see if we have any difficulties there. Probably 4D seismic from the surface. That allows us to see the steam chamber develop in the reservoir itself so that we can track that. And then as we come through the platform, we've got all of the flow assurance, as we mentioned, dropout of deposits. We're going to have huge fluctuations in temperature of arrival fluids. And finally, the future, well, certainly non-condensable gas and co-injection can reduce our steam utilization by 2. It slightly lowers partial pressure, but the miscibility adds so much to the movement and flow through the reservoir of the heavy oil. And finally, we could go subsea. If we want to go to deeper water where we can't drill with dry wells, but dry well heads, then there are options, in getting down to those subsea wells with steam. The future prize. At the moment, I got this from Oil and Gas UK's 2016 report, economic report. And what we have there is what is being produced in the North Sea and what will be produced. Perfect. And at the moment, producing and sanctioned is about 6 billion barrels. That would include Kraken and Mariner, obviously. And then on the future, what we see as discoveries that can be developed in conventional is around about 3-4 billion barrels. Then there's a small amount for deep water, HP. And then you see the yellow is heavy oil. There's about 800 million barrels there or less. So all they consider as producible is possibly Bressay, maybe a bit of Bentley. We're saying that there's something quite different out there. If you can steam inject, you can attack a lot more. About 4.5 billion barrels recovery. It transforms the North Sea objectives, if this is possible. There's about 9 billion barrels of discovered oil at the moment. A lot of wells haven't been drilled because they know they're going to find heavy oil. We've got 7 billion that we think, in one way or another, can be produced, some with very high recovery. I could identify all of those fields, but I've only got a couple of minutes, and you fall asleep. You can see where this is. There's a map on the right-hand side. Down below in beige is the central platform, which is where Pilot is. And then above, from the outer Moray Firth through to the Shetlands basin, there's a lot of heavy oil out there. So our thought is, if this works, which there's no technical reason it doesn't at the moment, it's going to be transformational. And finally, as a nod to the peers and others who've put in really good work, I think on the FPSOs recently, Armada Kraken on schedule, on budget. That is, as far as I'm aware now, producing at near enough nameplate capacity. Well done. BW Catcher coming under budget, and then the new projects of redeployment. We like to see that there's partners coming in early for good concept definition, getting hold of those life cycle costs, and getting the economics right. And then finally, Shell has decided to go through with Penguins. And what I liked is that there's an alliance there with Baker Hughes, with Sycar Point, and that can release yet another project of the Cambo FPSO. Thank you very much.